1. Major escalation of the conflict. Full-scale war. In February to March 2026, the largest military offensive to date by the USA and Israel against Iran took place, with bombings of hundreds of military, infrastructural, and political targets in Iran. The sun had barely risen on February 28, 2026, when the horizon over Tehran glowed with fire and smoke. In a thunderous dawn assault, the United States and Israel struck deep into Iran's heart, hitting military bases, missile sites, and key government compounds. World leaders called it Operation Epic Fury and Lion's Roar, a bold bid to end decades of tension by decapitating Iran's leadership and crippling its strike capabilities. Within hours, reports emerged that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in the barrage, setting off shockwaves across the region. In a small town on Iran's southern coast, families gathered outside a schoolyard. Laughter faded into screams as an unexpected blast tore through the building. Innocent lives lost in the chaos of war. Grief swept the nation. Iran did not wait. By midday, waves of missiles and drones thundered toward Israel and US bases across the Gulf. Air raid sirens wailed in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Rockets lit the night sky in Bahrain, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, marking the true birth of an open, full-scale conflict. In Tel Aviv, a mother pressed her children close in a cramped shelter as another barrage approached. Soldiers rushed to intercept incoming missiles, their faces tired but resolute. Israel vowed never to relent, declaring that each blow would be answered until its enemies were neutralized. Across the world, markets tumbled and diplomats hurried, fearing that this war would not stay contained. Global oil routes choked with stalled tankers as the Strait of Hormuz became a battleground. Calls for ceasefire echoed from the United Nations, yet the guns spoke louder than the words. By nightfall, both sides had tasted loss and retribution. The skies remained alive with the distant thunder of drones and rockets, and the world, once confident peace could prevail, suddenly stood on the brink of a new and uncertain era. 2. Death of the Supreme Leader of Iran. In the early hours of February 28, 2026, the ancient city of Tehran lay quiet under a cold sky. But that silence shattered in an instant when a barrage of missiles struck the heart of power. The world watched in shock as reports spread that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader since 1989, had been killed in joint US-Israeli airstrikes on his compound. It was a moment that would reshape the Middle East. All his life, Khamenei had been a figure both feared and revered, a man who steered Iran through revolutions, wars, and decades of confrontation with the West. For many inside Iran, he was the guardian of their nation's sovereignty. For others, he embodied the unyielding face of a repressive regime. When the news broke, the reactions were intense and swift. In Tehran's busy squares, some wept openly, draped in black, mourning a leader they believed had protected their homeland. Elsewhere, crowds erupted in cheers, seeing his death as the collapse of a regime that had brought hardship and isolation. Across the region, the skies remained tense. Iran's military commanders vowed retaliation, and rumors of strikes in distant capitals reached every news desk. On social media, the world was divided, some fearing a broader war, others hopeful that a new chapter had begun. Amid mourning and celebration, one thing was clear. The death of Iran's supreme leader wasn't just a headline. It was a turning point, marking the end of an era and the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter in Middle Eastern history. 3. Iran responds with missile and drone attacks. The sun had barely warmed the streets of Jerusalem when the sirens screamed their warning: incoming missiles. For weeks, the world had watched rising tensions after the dramatic strikes by Israel and the United States on Iran, but now Tehran had struck back with ferocity. In swift retaliation, Iran unleashed a huge barrage of ballistic missiles and armed drones toward Israel and military targets across the Gulf region. In a quiet kibbutz near the border, families huddled in reinforced shelters as the sky lit up with fiery streaks. The clatter of Iron Dome interceptors echoed above their heads, each explosion a bitter reminder that this was no longer distant politics but a war touching their homes. Across the shimmering waters of the Arabian Gulf, the conflict spread like a storm. In Dubai and Abu Dhabi, skies once crowded with gleaming skyscrapers witnessed the flash of debris and the roar of intercepted missiles. What began as a targeted military engagement had become a region-wide confrontation, drawing in neighboring states and forcing exhausted defense systems to their limits. Iran's leaders broadcast their vow of retaliation to millions. They said their homeland had been attacked first, and now they were defending it. The Revolutionary Guard Corps launched wave after wave of missiles and drones, not only at Israel but toward US military bases in Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE. In Israel's capital, everyday life seemed surreal. Coffee shops stood empty, streets felt hollow, and families watched news feeds instead of television series. A soldier on guard duty thought of his children back home, waiting for the familiar laugh that might never return. The world watched anxiously. Nations condemned the violence. Global leaders urged calm and negotiation. The United Nations called for an immediate ceasefire, fearing that this spiral of attacks would drag the entire Middle East into a full-scale war. Yet for every intercepted rocket and every patrol scrambled to meet another drone wave, the truth was chillingly clear. The skies were no longer safe, and the region was changing forever. 4. Mobilization and political support in Israel. In the spring of 2026, after weeks of missile exchanges between Iran and Israel, the mood inside Israel shifted from shock to determination. The sirens had become part of daily life. Children could tell the difference between a test alarm and a real one. But something else was rising alongside the fear: unity. When the government announced a nationwide mobilization, tens of thousands of reservists answered the call within hours. University students closed their laptops mid-lecture. Engineers left half-finished projects. Restaurant owners locked their doors and put on uniforms they had not worn in years. At recruitment centers in Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Beersheba, long lines formed before sunrise. In Jerusalem, the Knesset held an emergency session that stretched deep into the night. Political rivals who had argued fiercely just months earlier now stood shoulder to shoulder. Opposition leaders publicly backed the security cabinet, declaring that national defense came before party differences. "We debate in times of peace," one lawmaker said, "but we stand together in times of danger." The Prime Minister addressed the nation on live television. Behind him stood military chiefs and representatives from multiple political parties, a carefully chosen image of unity. He spoke calmly, acknowledging the fear people felt, but also emphasizing resilience. He promised that Israel would defend itself while seeking diplomatic channels to prevent further escalation. Across the country, civil society mobilized just as quickly as the army. Volunteers organized blood donation drives. Tech companies developed emergency communication apps to help families locate shelters and track updates in real time. Farmers in the north donated fresh produce to military bases. Hotels in safer areas offered free rooms to families evacuated from border towns. On social media, heated debates continued. This was still a democracy after all. Some citizens questioned strategy, others demanded stronger action. Yet beneath the arguments ran a shared understanding. Whatever their political beliefs, they were bound by the same uncertain future. Internationally, Israel worked to secure political backing. Delegations flew to Washington, London, and European capitals, emphasizing the need for defensive support and regional stability. While global leaders urged restraint, several reaffirmed Israel's right to self-defense. The diplomatic effort became as important as the military one. In a small apartment in Ashdod, a mother helped her son pack his reservist bag. She tried to smile as she folded his uniform. "We'll argue about politics when you're back," she joked softly. He hugged her and nodded. Outside, neighbors waved flags from balconies, not as a sign of aggression, but of solidarity. 5. Closure of airspace and aviation chaos. In the summer of 2026, the sky over the Middle East became a battlefield no pilot wanted to enter. It began with a single announcement: Israel was closing its airspace until further notice. Minutes later, Iran did the same. What had once been busy blue highways filled with passenger jets, cargo planes, and holiday travelers suddenly turned into empty corridors of uncertainty. At Ben Gurion Airport, departure boards flickered from on time to delayed, then to cancelled. Families stood frozen, staring at screens as if they might change back. A bride on her way to a wedding in Paris burst into tears. A businessman shouted into his phone, trying to explain to partners in London why he wouldn't arrive. Airport staff moved quickly, but no one could answer the most important question: when will we fly again? The closure came after escalating missile and drone exchanges between Iran and Israel. Defense systems were on high alert. Military officials warned that civilian aircraft could be at risk if they remained in the sky. Within hours, neighboring countries rerouted flights. Air traffic controllers across Europe and Asia scrambled to redraw maps in real time. Inside the control tower, Israeli controllers watched their radar screens clear one by one. Each disappearing dot meant another plane safely redirected. but also another sign that normal life was slipping away. In Tehran, similar scenes unfolded. Airports that once symbolized connection to the world now felt isolated, guarded by soldiers and uncertainty. Thousands of travelers were stranded across the region. Hotels filled beyond capacity. Social media flooded with videos of crowded terminals, sleeping children on suitcases, and exhausted airline staff handing out water bottles. Airlines faced massive losses. Cargo shipments were delayed, affecting food supplies, medical equipment, and global trade. For ordinary people, the chaos felt deeply personal. A student returning home to Haifa after studying abroad watched from Frankfurt as her flight was postponed again and again. A father in Tel Aviv tried to reassure his daughter that her summer camp abroad would wait. In Tehran, a grandmother held a gift she had bought for her grandson overseas, unsure when she would see him again. Governments held emergency meetings. Aviation authorities worked through the night, coordinating safe corridors over the Mediterranean and Central Asia. Some flights resumed days later, but with longer routes and higher ticket prices. The sky was no longer simple. What once seemed permanent, the freedom to board a plane and cross borders in hours, now felt fragile. In 2026, amid rising tensions between Iran and Israel, the closure of the skies became a powerful symbol. War did not only bring explosions and sirens, it grounded dreams, delayed reunions, and reminded the world that even the open sky can close. 6. Rhetoric of revenge and threats of further escalation. In 2026, the war between Iran and Israel was fought not only with missiles and drones, but with words sharp enough to cut across continents. After weeks of strikes and counterstrikes, both governments turned to microphones and cameras. In Tehran, a senior commander stood before a row of flags and promised unforgettable retaliation. His voice was calm, almost cold, as he warned that any further attack would be answered beyond imagination. The speech spread quickly across television and social media, shared millions of times within hours. In Jerusalem, Israeli leaders responded just as firmly. At a press conference broadcast worldwide, the Prime Minister declared that Israel would not be intimidated. "Every threat," he said, "will be met with strength. Every attack will have consequences." Behind him stood military officials, their silence reinforcing the message. The rhetoric escalated daily. Each side accused the other of starting the conflict. Each promised decisive action if provoked again. Headlines grew darker. Analysts on global news channels debated what beyond imagination might mean. Markets reacted nervously. Oil prices rose and fell with every new statement. Ordinary people listened with growing anxiety. In Tel Aviv, a teacher checked her phone between classes, reading updates while her students whispered about war. In Tehran, a shop owner turned up the volume on a radio as leaders spoke, wondering whether the next threat would become reality. Words felt heavier than ever, as if they carried the weight of missiles. Diplomats from Europe and Asia urged restraint. The United Nations called for de-escalation, warning that continued threats could push the region into a wider war. But the speeches continued. Strong language became a weapon, a way to project power, reassure supporters, and intimidate opponents. Yet beneath the dramatic phrases and televised warnings lay a deeper truth. Rhetoric can inspire unity, but it can also trap leaders in their own promises. The louder the threats became, the harder it was for either side to step back without appearing weak. In 2026, as Iran and Israel exchanged fierce words across borders, the world realized that escalation does not begin with explosions. Sometimes it begins with a sentence, spoken into a microphone, echoed across screens, and heard by millions who hope it will not be followed by fire. 7. Russia and China increased cooperation with Iran. In 2026, as tensions between Iran and Israel intensified, the conflict began to stretch far beyond the Middle East. It was no longer only about missiles crossing the sky. It was about alliances forming quietly behind closed doors. When reports emerged that Russia and China were deepening cooperation with Iran, the world paid close attention. Official statements spoke of economic partnerships and regional stability, but many analysts saw something more strategic unfolding. In Moscow, Iranian and Russian officials met in a grand hall under heavy chandeliers. Cameras captured firm handshakes and serious expressions. Russia promised expanded energy cooperation, advanced trade agreements, and closer military coordination exercises. Though carefully worded, the message was clear. Iran would not stand alone. Meanwhile, in Beijing, Chinese diplomats hosted Iranian representatives for high-level talks. China emphasized infrastructure investments, technology partnerships, and long-term oil agreements. Ships continued to move through key trade routes, and new contracts were signed that strengthened economic ties between the two nations. For Israel, these developments felt like a widening circle. What had begun as a direct confrontation with Iran now carried the weight of global power politics. Israeli officials warned that external backing could embolden Tehran. They worked urgently to reinforce their own international alliances, holding meetings with Western partners and seeking diplomatic pressure on Moscow and Beijing. Inside Iran, state television presented the new partnerships as proof of resilience. Commentators described a new global balance, arguing that cooperation with Russia and China would protect Iran from isolation and sanctions. Crowds gathered in public squares to watch the announcements on giant screens, some cheering at the idea of stronger allies. In Tel Aviv, conversations in cafes turned from local security concerns to global strategy. People wondered what it meant when powerful nations chose sides, even indirectly. A university student studying international relations told her friend, "This isn't just a regional conflict anymore, it's a chessboard." Across the world, leaders urged caution. They feared that deeper involvement by major powers could transform a dangerous regional war into something far more unpredictable. Markets reacted nervously, and diplomatic channels buzzed with urgent calls. In 2026, as Russia and China increased cooperation with Iran, the conflict between Iran and Israel took on a new dimension. It was no longer just about borders or retaliation. It was about influence, alliances, and the shifting balance of global power, a reminder that in modern conflicts the battlefield often extends far beyond where the rockets fall. 8. The nuclear program remains a key cause of the conflict. In 2026, beneath the noise of sirens and the flash of missiles, one issue remained at the heart of the conflict between Iran and Israel: Iran's nuclear program. For years, Israel had warned that a nuclear-armed Iran would change the balance of power in the Middle East forever. Iranian leaders insisted their program was for peaceful energy and scientific progress. But suspicion had grown like a shadow, stretching across borders and decades. Deep underground in fortified facilities, centrifuges continued to spin. Engineers in white coats monitored screens glowing in sterile control rooms. To them, it was science: complex equations, enriched uranium levels, international inspections. To Israel, it was an existential threat. In Jerusalem, intelligence briefings became more urgent. Military officials pointed to satellite images and reports suggesting that Iran was advancing its enrichment capabilities. Political leaders debated long into the night. Should they wait for diplomacy or act before it was too late? Every decision carried enormous risk. In Tehran, the nuclear program had become a symbol of sovereignty. State television described it as a matter of national pride. University students studied nuclear physics, dreaming of technological breakthroughs. Yet outside government buildings, some citizens quietly wondered whether the program was worth the danger it brought. When tensions escalated in 2026, the nuclear question was never far from the surface. Israeli officials stated openly that they could not allow Iran to cross what they called the point of no return. Iranian leaders responded that they would never surrender their scientific rights under pressure. Diplomats tried to restart negotiations. European envoys shuttled between capitals, proposing limits, inspections, and phased agreements. But trust was fragile. Each side feared that the other was buying time. Ordinary people felt the weight of decisions made far above them. In Tel Aviv, a father watched the news while his children played nearby, wondering if a hidden laboratory hundreds of kilometers away could determine their future. In Tehran, a shopkeeper closed early as rumors spread about possible airstrikes on nuclear sites. The nuclear program was more than technology. It was fear, pride, deterrence, and distrust woven together. In 2026, as the conflict between Iran and Israel intensified, it became clear that missiles and speeches were only symptoms. At the core of the struggle lay a deeper question: could security for one nation exist without insecurity for another? Until that question found an answer, the centrifuges and the tension continued to spin. 9. Risk of global and economic destabilization. In 2026, the conflict between Iran and Israel was no longer only a regional crisis. It had become a global tremor, shaking markets, governments, and ordinary lives far beyond the Middle East. It started with rising tensions, missile strikes, political threats, military mobilization. But the real shock came when oil tankers slowed in the Strait of Hormuz. Insurance rates for shipping soared overnight. Traders in London, New York, and Tokyo stared at screens as oil prices climbed sharply within hours. In Frankfurt, a factory manager calculated how much higher fuel costs would affect production. In Mumbai, a taxi driver checked the price of gasoline and shook his head. In São Paulo, a supermarket owner noticed imported goods becoming more expensive. What was happening thousands of kilometers away was suddenly visible in grocery bills and electricity costs. Stock markets reacted with nervous swings. Investors moved money into gold and safer assets. Airlines cancelled routes, worried about closed airspace and higher fuel prices. Global supply chains, already fragile from past crises, felt the pressure again. Governments called emergency meetings. Economic advisors warned that prolonged instability could trigger inflation and slow growth worldwide. Central banks debated interest rates. Diplomats urged restraint, not only to prevent military escalation, but to protect global stability. In Israel, families prepared for uncertainty. In Iran, businesses struggled under tightening sanctions and disrupted trade. Yet the ripple effect extended further. African countries dependent on imported grain faced higher costs. European nations worried about energy security. Asian economies recalculated trade routes. News anchors spoke of global destabilization. Experts explained how interconnected the modern world had become. A single conflict could influence energy markets, shipping lanes, technology investments, and even currency values. For many people, the connection felt distant but real. A university student in Canada watched oil prices spike and wondered how it would affect her tuition and rent. A small business owner in Italy postponed expansion plans, unsure what the coming months would bring. In 2026, the world was reminded of a simple truth. In an age of globalization, no conflict stays local. The confrontation between Iran and Israel carried not only political and military consequences, but economic shockwaves capable of touching nearly every household on the planet. 10. International diplomacy on the edge. In 2026, as tensions between Iran and Israel reached dangerous heights, international diplomacy stood on a razor's edge. Missiles had already crossed borders. Harsh speeches filled television screens. But behind the scenes, in quiet conference rooms far from the sound of sirens, diplomats worked urgently to prevent the situation from spiraling into a wider war. In New York, the United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session. Ambassadors spoke in carefully measured tones, calling for restraint while avoiding words that might offend allies. Every sentence was negotiated, every phrase weighed. A single misstep could harden positions instead of softening them. In Geneva, European mediators shuttled between Iranian and Israeli representatives who refused to sit at the same table. Messages were passed indirectly, sometimes reduced to a few lines on paper. We are willing to pause if... We demand guarantees that... Trust was scarce, but communication had not completely broken down. Washington and Moscow held tense phone calls. Beijing offered to host talks. Regional powers in the Gulf urged calm, fearing the conflict could spill across their own borders. Diplomacy became a complex web of calls, encrypted messages, and late-night negotiations. Inside Israel, leaders debated how much space to give diplomats. Military commanders warned that delays could weaken deterrence. Politicians argued that a diplomatic opening might prevent further bloodshed. Public opinion was divided, but most people wanted one thing: security without endless war. In Iran, officials balanced pride with pragmatism. They spoke firmly in public, insisting on sovereignty and resistance. In private, some advisors acknowledged the heavy economic and social cost of continued escalation. The question was not only how to respond, but how to step back without appearing weak. At one crucial moment, a proposal for a temporary ceasefire nearly collapsed over a single word in a draft statement. Hours passed as negotiators debated language. Outside the building, reporters waited in the cold, guessing at outcomes. Finally, a revised version was accepted. It was not peace, only a fragile pause, but it kept the door open. In 2026, diplomacy between Iran and Israel did not look dramatic. There were no grand ceremonies or historic handshakes. Instead, it was slow, tense, and uncertain. Yet in those quiet rooms, away from cameras and headlines, the future of the region balanced on conversations that might never be remembered, but could determine whether the next sound in the sky would be a missile or silence.